Hello again. I am Suren, and welcome to the program. Many of my friends, associates, and people like yourself all around the world, and some of my students have been asking me to speak once more about the nature of intelligence. The nature of intelligence. When we decide to explore the intelligence, we are faced with a precarious venture. Before we even begin, we need to know what we are looking for, and there is no generally accepted definition of intelligence, because it is very hard to describe where it begins, and what it consists of is to enable us to define life itself. There is no consensus about the point in the evolutionary development at which life might have begun. There is no exact demarcation between life and non-life. Did life really begin when amino acid molecules first formed in a self-replicating chainsaw like fractals? Where could we find the boundary between the replication of crystal formations and carbon compounds? There is no boundary. Life, as we know, is a flow. It begins in inorganic materials and emerges slowly along its course for sentience and intelligence to become observable. The same may be said of intelligence, because it starts with the simple awareness of limited elements of the environment and proceeds towards awareness of the self. And then to abstract ideation by the most gradual stages within a study, and we can analyze it at any time along the continuum of life itself, but no one has yet been able to summarize its completeness to the satisfaction of anyone else. Before we go any further, we need to clarify that our investigation is not about the qualities of brilliant human mental achievements and the nature of the minds of those gifted individuals with great brains, but of intelligence as an expression of life itself. To find some answer to what it means, let me start with some questions. Does an organism recognize its surroundings and what it must do to exist in them? What is the mechanism by which it makes decisions? Is it in fact a thought? Thought is, as you know, non-material. We cannot touch it, see it, or measure it. Yet, at its inception, it proceeds from a material organ, from the living tissue of the brain as observed, and as an outcome, it is directed and rises in concrete actions. This is the mystery of the thinking process, but it is in itself intangible. If we examine the thinking process back to its origins in the brain, we will find ourselves back again at the origins of life. Being sensitive to external stimuli is a property of every living cell. Over the ages, the forces of evolution or creation fostered the combination of single cells into more complex organisms, and certain cells become specialized for the execution of certain functions within those organisms. The response to external stimuli became centralized in the cells, specially designed for this purpose, and they are indeed in the neurons. At first in extremely simple and gradually increasingly complex nervous system. The environmental circumstance and the increasing complexity of the organisms put a premium on the development of a coordinating center for the nervous system's messages. An area of the nervous system cells begin to specialize for this function, and as time advances, evolve into the organ we call it the brain. The brain is the outcome of sensitivity to stimuli, that most primitive and most basic quality of life itself. One fundamental property of life resides within the chemistry of carbon compounds, in their propensity to form chains, to proliferate, and to polymerize. Life is manifested itself by profusion, and out of this profusion and redundancy comes the inevitability of selection. Germ cells are generated by the millions when only one would suffice. Multitude of seeds and fruits are produced, but only a few find congenial soil and take root. Animals give birth to offspring far in excess of the needs of the species to maintain themselves, and only the best adapted survive. Consider that profusion exists to create a possibility for selection issues at theology call. Thinking in any case not accurate, solution takes place because there is a fresh profusion, and this principle holds in many manifestations of life, not least in the brain. There are at least 10,000 million cells in the human brain, and more by many factors that can possibly be necessary to effect any action important for the organism. Thought arises only as brains become more complex. We can then consider that it is an outcome of just that redundancy. In the same way that millions of germ cells, thousands of seeds, hundreds of offspring allow for the production of new biological entities, or even a single one that will prove viable. So, we must assume that it takes millions of brain cells in some way activated by and operating upon the neural messages they receive to produce a thought. We know that a thought is a single and fleeting entity. However, it's quite possible that before the thought reaches the level of consciousness, its elements are reproduced in the same profusion as the germ cells. The germ cell is not a single element. It is vastly complex assemblage of elements. Nevertheless, in accordance with a message of living matter, it is duplicated millions of times in order to perpetuate life. One single neuron cannot produce thought. Neither will 100, nor even 1,000. The phenomenon of thought becomes possible only when a near infinitude of possible interactions between millions of brain cells and their myriad axons and dendrites or fibers that branch from cells, connecting them with other cells, are present. In some way, not yet fully understood, thought is a quality that emerges from the sheer number of interactive nerve cells, and a single thought can be conceived as their multiple echo. This is not the end of the process. When we use the germ cells as a paradigm, it is possible that even this mass of elements that has produced a thought is itself replicated thousands of times. I don't know how else we can explain the phenomenon that when a part of a brain is damaged, or even totally incapacitated, other parts of the brain take over and thought processes of the organism persist. That's a question. Someone who may have suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, which may have destroyed a large area of her or his brain, and yet his memory or her memory persisted, that he or she did some of his best work subsequently. Following any psychosurgical intervention, where substantial tracts of the brain are cut, there is no intellectual impairment. Brain function is but another aspect of the redundancy that prevails throughout nature and appears to be an essential element of life. But this only describes, does not explain the emergence of an intangible thought from a tangible mass of living matter. Although we cannot explain the mechanism by which the quality we call thought arises, we can see the principle concretely in action, in the observation all life's forms. At the lowest level, a single-celled organism such as Paramecium responds predictably to certain stimuli. At the next stage, slightly more complex creatures evince reflex responses to a wider range of stimuli. At a higher level still, we find nervous system genetically programmed to respond to environmental conditions by behavior that is increasingly complex. And finally, a brain composed of a number of cells sufficient to allow for alternative rather than stereotyped responses. It is at this point that it might be said that the true intelligence, the higher animal and human sense, enters the picture, because where alternative solutions become apparent, a choice must be made. And the ability to choose between alternatives is at the heart of intelligence in its higher manifestations. From laboratory experiments which were made on artificially isolated neurons, should appear that single nerve cells operated on a simple yes or no principle. They were able to transmit a stimulus or not, but it is equally observable from the behavior of living creatures that as brains increase in volume and their size, or let us call it arborization of their cells, the result over the sum of 4 yes or no decisions of each of the cells is longer. A simple measure decision must be made with yes and no combinations, and possibilities arise which offer alternatives from which a course of action may be selected. As the number of possible alternatives increase, the ultimate result becomes more uncertain or unpredictable. We can have indeed taken the steps from intelligence to higher intelligence, and even to genius. Intelligence selects between alternatives which become very visible. However, intelligence or genius works on the basis of many perceived alternatives that one cannot anticipate or predict which will be chosen. Until recently, in our modern days, it was thought that intelligence, logic, the capacity to reason, or whatever name was applied to the highest mental function, was a factor that decisively separated mankind from the rest of the animal world. It was believed that the power of the mind was an endowment of our species alone, conferred upon us by the so-called Creator, and that with it went spatial prerogatives. We were lords of creation. Today, however, it is clear to us that mind or intelligence is, like every other attribute of our species, at a stage in an ongoing process. We see the elements of intelligence emerging in varying degrees in many species of higher animals of all classes. It is not property of mammalian, but is a quality towards which forms of life tend. Living creatures come to depend increasingly on intelligence for their survival, as selective pressure is set up that results in excess accretions to that part of the brain that promotes it. The use of intelligence and its physical base in the brain that facilitates it work on each other in a circular fashion, each enlarging the capacity of the other over generations. We are heir to all life that preceded us, and we shall pass on our characteristics, both physical and mental, for use and further modification and refinement to all those that succeed us. The information that neither human beings nor their brains nor any other of their attributes are unique phenomena, but an aspect of life and a part of its flow, is helpful to us in discerning life's overall patterns. We see that these patterns seem to have certain structures, repeated in many of the life's most fundamental processes. This could very well be because of all life ultimately is based on carbon compounds, and so the properties of carbon compounds inevitably influence processes of life. The principles of redundancy and selection and of ultimate constraints are at work in evolution, as well as in the brain. We find the message of the brain repeating the message of evolution. The nervous system receives a manifold redundancy of stimuli from the external world, but it is so constructed to delete filters out. But a few of them eventually registers, only knows that the organism can use, and in fact it selects from profusion. It can change the information that is useful and discarding all other information. Now, evolutionary process, too, is based on redundant profusion. Thousands and tens of thousands of individuals combine and recombine the possibilities of their genetic endowment until eventually one or some few individuals are produced that possess some slight modification with some, often very small, advantage over others of their kind. The progeny of these few individuals inevitably become the objects of blind natural selection until their issue with their new characteristics permeates and ultimately replaces the population from which it sprang. In this way, each tiny step of change has its trial of life is either rejected and discarded or selected and incorporated into its continuing flow. So, close are these patterns of operation: profusion or redundancy, retaining or discarding, selection, that we could call intelligence a kind of speeded up evolution, or evolution a painstaking and slow but implacable intelligence. Can intelligence be considered as information, perhaps? That's a question. Certainly, there is a universality because the nerve tissue which any human brain is composed of can receive only encoded signals. But there is no brain which can perceive a visual image the way a piece of photographic film registers, or your video camera can, of such patterns of light. that visual image needs to be reduced to electrochemical signals by the messenger nerves for them to be able to carry information about it to the brain. It is not only a sight, but also a sound, a touch, a smell, or any other information brought by the senses, whether on planet Earth or on any other perceivable planet. It needs therefore be encoded in order to be recorded or registered. Different senses must filter out and relay different pieces of information. But once the information reaches the nerve, it is of no consequence whether the encoding is a result of perception by visual, chemical, electrical, or any other type of senses. The end result is a pattern of engrams in the brain that are then processed. All those messages which are carried by the nervous system to the brain from both the outer and the inner world of the organism, called information, because, in a sense, this is their nature. In effect, two major filtering processes take place. The first one is affected when the senses select from the myriad available stimuli those bits of information that by their nature they are evolved to perceive, and the second when the still great mass of pre-filtered news reaches the cognitive centers of the brain, where it must be in some fashion ordered, categorized, meaning derived from it as it relates to the organism, and suitable responses to it initiated if necessary. This information rarely becomes incorporated in the cognitive centers of the brain in pure form. As it is processed, it is also modulated, either dampened or intensified, and also elaborated in terms of such factors as experience, attention, expectation, pleasure, needs, motivation, or the absence of these. The elaborated information becomes subject to evaluation, which to a large extent involves a matching against previous experience, and then, depending upon the interpretation put upon the elaborated information, it is either acted upon or ignored, stored in the memory to add to the organism's sum of experience, or obliterated and forgotten. There is one other possibility available among the brain's processes, and that is the so-called short-term memory. This falls between remembering and forgetting, since it is a method of dealing with the information that is useful only for a limited time. We do not have to remember for a lifetime where we put our key yesterday, or to remind the dairyman to deliver the milk, or the content of a German sentence that we must hold in our minds. Or it could be French or Italian, until we come to its verb. So the items such as these are stored in what might be called a temporary warehouse, only for so long as they are needed, and then turned out in a process of forgetting. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is stored and becomes the permanent, a library we call experience, which may be referred to throughout a lifetime, like what I'm doing now. For instance, long-term memory, in fact, is the mainstay that permits a creature to exist in an environment without overburdening cognitive system by perpetually re-exploring and re-evaluating every sensory impression. It enables the creature automatically to match incoming impressions against previously experienced ones. New information arouses all an animal's alerting mechanisms and puts it into a state of alarmed readiness for any eventuality. But signals that have been experienced before and matched against the earlier ones need only to be given the degree of attention they warrant, insofar as long-term memory enables appropriate rather than inappropriate responses to be made. It forms one of the elements of intelligence. Now, research points toward the great likelihood that long-term memory is encoded by means of changes in the structure of the nucleic acids of the brain cells. If this turns out to be the case, then there is more than just a semantic analogy between the memory of the brain and the memory of the genes. The brain's memory is ephemeral, unless committed to cultural recording and passed on in that manner. It dies with the individual, whereas genetic memory embedded into germ cells may be transmitted through a range of generations, so long as our planet supports life. Perhaps one can highlight yet another aspect of this concept. As we now know, non-human primates also possess a large untapped potential, not on a genetic part of a mental level for intellectual achievement, that the circumstances of their natural existence have not called forth. Among primates, only our own species is in the process of tapping to the full the possibilities of information stored as memory. Here again, we see a unity in life's processes. Memory and genetic inheritance are each achieved by a system of information storage, probably very similar in brain or in germ substance, that holds the available for recall, the blueprints necessary for life's continuity. Thus, intelligence is not a late arriving addition to evolution's repertoire. It does not, like Athena, spring from the head of a metaphorical Zeus suddenly and without biological parentage. On the contrary, it is of the stuff and essence of life. The genetic code itself is a form of intelligence, as is memory, and since life is perpetuated via a code of stored information, intelligence must be considered as an inevitable, eventual outcome. There's more to it. Intelligence and self. We have looked at a huge subject through several openings, through each of which we get a different view of it, so that ultimately we may obtain a better understanding of its whole nature than we could by seeing it from one aspect alone. The more angles from which we view it, the more it becomes apparent that there is an underlying driving force common to them all. We might clarify this in our minds by thinking of extremely diverse pieces of machinery that produce a great variety of end products, as in a bottling plant, or carpentry, bread, streetcar, lighting system. Although these vastly imprint apparatuses serve totally different purposes, except in so far as they all serve human convenience, they are all ultimately operated by the same force: electricity. The principles of electrical energy are common to the operation of them all. Now let us consider inner knowledge that is chemically built into each of the cells of a living organism that permit them to interact with and influence over each other in extremely complex ways. This is particularly apparent in the embryo, where each cell seems to know when to proliferate and when to stop proliferating, how far to go, and which direction it must migrate to take its place in the body as a specialized unit or one of the body's organs, and also when to start or to stop any of the bodily developments and processes through which it must go on the way to its maturity and in the course of its life. We can illustrate this facet of life's own intelligence by describing something of another one of the cells. Many functions its immune protective capacity. No form of life is invulnerable to invading organisms. So for any life form to have survived, it must be possessed of some kind of protective mechanism. Indeed, this is so in many levels in a plant's defensive weapons, such as stings, thorns, or poisons. Animals' ability to fight off or disguise itself from predators, or in patterns or behavior that promotes survival more subtly. It may be possible that during the early emergence of life, at the period when single-celled organisms began to evolve into multicellular ones, symbiotic relationships existed between its simplest forms and were factors in promoting organic complexity. Over time, perhaps due to mutations or to purely chemical factors, some of the symbiotic relationships may have become converted into parasite-host relationships, in which the needs of the parasite became detrimental to those of the host. However, we cannot be absolutely certain of the exact origin of the invasion and infection of some organisms by such others as viruses or bacteria, so as to impair the viability of the host. But we do know that organisms have evolved certain cell structures that exercise almost incredibly sophisticated defenses against such invasions. It is to these that we refer when we speak about the immune protective system. In the most advanced higher animals, we find the immune mechanism specialized into two types. One originates in the thymus gland, which manufactures the so-called T lymphocytes. The other type is produced in the bone marrow and the spleen and is referred to as B lymphocytes. These two types of cells at first appear to be identical under microscopic examination, but radioactive tagging reveals different surface markings. The T cells respond to fungi, viruses, tumors, and foreign tissues. Their metabolic activities enable them to interact directly with these invaders and to prevent their proliferation in a way that at the current time is still under intense investigation. This is the cellular immune response. The processes of the B lymphocytes are better understood today. They respond to bacterial infections, viral reinfections, and to allergens. When any of these invade the body, the B lymphocytes convert themselves into plasma cells that produce antibodies, which are secreted into and carried by the bloodstream in the gamma globulin fraction of the serum. This is referred to as the humoral immune response. After it completes its final differentiation and becomes a plasma cell, it manufactures about 2,000 identical antibodies per second. It fully executes within 3 to 4 days. Each is confined to the production of antibodies of a single class. In a later stage of the interaction between the invader and the host organism, uncommitted lymphocytes are stimulated by the persisting presence of the antigen to form additional B cells, called memory cells. This enables an organism that has been exposed to a specific invader once to respond more promptly and vigorously in the event of later encounters. Within the entire immune system, each cell is able to recognize a particular antigen. An antigen is a substance that involves a host organism and has a characteristic protein that unmistakably announces its identity and is in effect its calling card. There are literally millions of such antigens, and there are equally as many immunologically active cells that are capable of recognizing and interacting with them. Among the operations of the cell itself, we find in the immune system a close analogy with a memory of the brain and that of the genetic structure. Each system receives literally millions of bits of information from which it is capable of selecting what is relevant to its own function, of encoding that information it selects, and of storing the encoded selection and in its own form of memory. Moreover, the brain, the genes, and the cell are able to call on those stores of memory and to use them when location or necessity arises. The fundamental underlying all of these manifestations of intelligence lies in the chemical nature of the carbon compounds, which are building blocks and source of life on Earth. The life force itself derives from the propensity to replicate and to form long grains. No matter how few the number of molecules comprising an original carbon chain proliferates, unless it is inhibited, and forms a mass, whether of the millions of body cells in all their eventual diversity, or the diversity of specialized brain cells among which millions register stimuli, and produce thought, of specialized gene cells that register the organism's template and reproduce it, or of specialized immune system cells register a memory of antigens and produce antibodies that will combat them. Once again, talking about the principle of redundancy, and in registering it, we are obliged to repeat the life process as an intelligence process. Wherever we find any kind of life, no matter how primitive, intelligent, constantly refined by life's own processes, sooner or later is bound to emerge as we understand it. In the highly distilled forms of thought, reason, and judgment. This is what we can say for now. But when it comes to thought, there is much more to it. Is thought produced outside and received by our brains? Or do our brains really produce thought and intelligence? That's a subject of speciality, and we will come to that next time. Enough is said for today in the scientific and medical level. Keep smiling and be happy until next time, and I will meet you again at this place in here by the next episode. Thank you.